I'd like to bring your attention to this worksheet that you'll find, I think, on the left-hand side of your folder. And this worksheet will help guide you step by step through sort of trying to focus the group's discussion on what are the research questions that would be most important and most interesting for us as a community of practice to pursue, and what are the really good successful models that we know about now that we may want to consider trying to replicate from context to context. So about the discussion groups, there's some tables may be quite crowded. There's a couple tables that only have a few people. So we can split a larger group into two tables, or the people who have very few participants at their table can join a different group. Please feel free, but we have 10 tables in the room, and that doesn't mean we have to have 10 separate discussion topics if 6 or 7 of them are the most interesting, but you also don't have to be crowded and not get a word in edgewise. You could split a large group into 2 tables if that looks like the easiest way to go. So please do just work out what would make the most sense to you for your discussion topic. Also, each facilitator has a little prompt in case you're having a hard time thinking about what sort of some questions to get your group started. There's a summary about the topic and some questions that could be food for thought, but I think that all of us have come with such burning questions already, you may not even need to take a glance at that, so don't worry about it, but it's a resource there for you if it would be useful. Let's have the group discussions from now until 11:45. That gives us 25 minutes. And in 25 minutes, if you could be taking the flip chart paper for your discussion topic off the wall, note down your key notes about research questions and promising approaches onto that flip chart paper. We can be doing a gallery walk by 11:50 at 10 of 12, so that we can all have a sense of what everyone else discussed before we come together and think about what are our next steps from here. So please flag down any of us from FHI 360 if you're having any questions about getting your group work started, if you need anything while you're working, and otherwise really enjoy this conversation and dig in. Ask the challenging questions. As Rebecca said, don't be afraid to admit failures. Don't be afraid to say, gosh, this is a really difficult situation and we're not quite sure what to do. And don't be afraid to talk about, wait, we did something that worked really well and this may interest you. So enjoy the conversation.
Hi. No, only this group. So anyone who's joining online gets to join our group. Lucky us. So I've got
I'm
my...
I'm monitoring the questions online.
Right, exactly. So basically what that means is that anyone who's joining, I don't know if we know how many people there are, but welcome everybody who's joining us online. And we have questions that may come in and can join the discussion. And it looks like our group has grown a little bit. Wonderful. We are very happy to have you. It looks like this is a heavily SIL table, which is exciting, and FHI 360 and the Global Reading Network. So you have a mic in front of you, and if you push the button, it turns green, and that means you're live. So if you want to say something, just push the button before you do. So this group is talking about the collection and use of data on language use and mastery, and sort of drawing a little bit from what I presented, but of course what we did isn't necessarily the only way to do a language mapping, and I know there's expertise at this table on different ways of doing language mapping and other ways of collecting data and using it. So we want to start to get into some of that. So the prompt here, and a couple of us have the prompt only, so I'm just going to quickly just tell you, generally summarize what's here, and then we can go from there. So the idea is that every country and often every region or every town and even every school may have a unique language profile. So in some cases, the effective language of instruction is clear, and in other cases, it isn't. So we want to talk about how we collect and use data and what we may need to find out in order to make informed decisions about programming and policy, what you do with the data once you have it. What are some options for that? So let's just go around and introduce ourselves, and then we can get the conversation started. So I'm Annie Smiley. I'm with FHI 360's Global Education Department, and I manage our monitoring and evaluation team.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Claire O'Leary, and I'm just beginning a role in SIL Lead. I've worked with SIL International for many years, and I work as the Director of Community-Based Programs for SIL Lead. For SIL International, I started my career doing what we call language survey research, so on-the-ground data collection, and then training others in that, and started in northern Pakistan, and then did a lot in India, trained a lot of Indian colleagues to do data collection. So,
Great.
and I'm currently part of an SIL lead project analyzing data that's already been collected for the Afghanistan project that we're working on.
Then you bring a lot to this table, so thank you for coming here.
So I'm Paul Frank, I'm the Executive Director for SIL Lead. I've never actually done any language mapping, but I've had oversight of that arena in several spots within SIL. We did a small consultancy in Liberia of language mapping and a project there. We've just recently participated in this one in Afghanistan. So I'm very interested in the area and probably don't have as much knowledge about details of it, but I think it's fascinating. I'm really, really glad to see that people are stepping up and doing this research.
I'm Emily Mixick at FHI 360, and I'm the technical advisor for literacy and evaluation. I work with Annie closely on Ghana and have been working with the materials development team, coming up with scripted daily lessons and the materials for students and so on, decodables, and we're trying to catch up to the language data. So as the language data comes in, we're in the process of developing the materials, so we need to react quickly as far as now how are we going to use this data and use it to the best advantage of the students to learn.
Hi, Jennifer Gurst with the Global Reading Network, and working with the community of practice on reading. But I guess to this table sort of will bring my past experiences working in the field of education. I haven't done language mapping myself, but what really sort of fascinates me about this tool is that over time and working with ministries of education, a big issue has always been sort of the lack of data, or really trouble figuring out how to use data to inform policy. So that aspect really interests me quite a bit about the presentation that you made, and particularly just the implications from teacher deployment to teaching learning materials, how it gets to the schools. It just sort of reminds me over the years with the different work that I did with Millennium Challenge Corporation and in other projects in terms of designing programs, how you just have to keep cognizant that you're not operating sort of in an isolated sense. It's not just my reading project, but there's a larger issue in terms of sustainability and thinking about how to scale projects that seem to work. That's out there, and just the challenges of working within the systems that are in place. So that aspect has always sort of fascinated me a lot, and was just interesting. So I'd be interested to hear more about that.
Great, thank you. Jane?
Hi, I'm Jane Sullivan from FHI 360. I am on the business development team, and I'm helping Annie facilitate this discussion, and I'm also monitoring the webcast. So for anyone who's online and wants to join, you can type a question. I know some of you online said that you're from RTI. Would anybody else like to introduce themselves?
Type quickly.
We aren't given very much information on this end about who's participating online. So we appreciate your speaking up. Okay.
All right, well, as anyone comes online and wants us to introduce them, just please type it in and Jane can jump in. So let's just get started with thinking about what are the main factors we need to think about when we consider a language mapping or some kind of major language data collection. What do we need to be thinking about from all these different perspectives in terms of tool development, census versus survey, use of technology, what kinds of people we need to interview, what kinds of tools we need to be using, do we need to be doing actual linguistic assessments? So let's just start thinking about what are the key factors that we need to consider when we're trying to design a language mapping. And I know it also depends on the purpose of the language mapping. So maybe that's the first thing is what's the purpose, right? What are we going to use the information for? And so I think, moving from there are different reasons why we might do language mapping. So maybe what are the different reasons? What are the purposes for doing it?
Well, it seems most of the conversations today are focusing on education and basic primary education, early grade learning, those kinds of purposes to make that more effective, and that's certainly true. But there are all sorts of other ways that the languages of the communities, knowing more, a better picture, a clear picture of the languages spoken in the communities and people's attitudes towards them, the uses of them, can help with like health awareness, for example, or various other kinds of issues that people just need information that they understand well.
Yeah.
And so whether it's early grade learning in kids or their parents in the communities, that's all an aspect as well. So depends on your purpose.
Sense. Yep, exactly. Paul?
When we did the mapping in Liberia, time was limited, and so we hammered pretty hard on so what are decisions do you have to make? Mm-hmm. So, all right, what information is needed to make a coherent decision? All right, what data are we going to gather? And kind of work backward from that rather than taking a standard, okay, when we do a language mapping, we go out and we do X, Y, and Z.
Right. It's got to depend on...
Yeah, so we were pretty ruthless in that case to kind of get it down to... And the question was, if we do this Basa language initiative in those, I think it was like 100 schools or whatever, do we have confidence that that is going to be a good match to those schools? And they found 6 places where it wasn't. But by and large, it confirmed the understanding.
Right.
And it wasn't a highly multilingual environment, but there was a specific research purpose.
Right.
On the other hand, there's value in having enough of a broader framework so that whenever somebody goes to the trouble to gather data, you gather enough stuff that could utilize for other purposes. So I think there's good in kind of a community of practice approach to say, what kinds of basic facts are going to be useful for a variety of purposes? I think that would be important, a valuable thing to do. Some of that might just start by a standard landscape kind of thing, so where have people in the last 5 years or so during the reading push actually done language mapping?
Right.
What questions did they ask? What did they do with the data?
You mean map the language mappings?
Yeah. So I think that would be valuable.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
And the other thing that's on my mind about purpose is that I just yesterday wrote the head of the kind of the SIL's ethnologue effort to say, okay, can we find some way to harvest the information that's been gathered for project-specific purposes and feed that into a broader data store from which people then can draw subsequently. We don't have that figured out, but I think there's a huge opportunity to mine the language mapping data for
other purposes.
For reference purposes.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have some other people from online who want to introduce themselves.
Okay.
So we have Allison Flepson from Global Reading Network. And then we have a teacher who's trying to develop a reading program with classroom tools to support teachers in public schools. And then we have Rochelle Harris-Hussein from USAID Nigeria, who is just listening in.
Great.
And then Allison has a question, or one has a comment. She says, one important aspect of language mapping is doing an assessment of kids to find out what they know in different languages. People doing this kind of work should check out a report about some new AGRA subtasks that have recently been piloted to help people assess children's oral language abilities. In a previous post, she included the name of the report in the URL on the Global Reading Network's website.
Great, thank you, Allison.
And then we also have Elk, Karen, and Diane Rogue from SIL International. They're joining from Dallas, and Winnie Sheratic from the PAL Network.
Great.
So we have
Some
people.
Yeah, so please, as you're listening, please go ahead and type questions. And I know we don't have unlimited time, but we will do our best to be responding to those, and Jane will be responsive. And thanks, Allison, for that resource that you're posting, and we'll definitely go and check that out. Okay, so she's actually mentioning that testing kids is a part of what is being recommended in some cases. Of course, it depends, again, what's the purpose of the language mapping. To just go describe a little bit about what we did, actually it was Emily who came up with the concept of language match, I think, originally. You were the sort of, I mean, I know it's not a brand new concept, but you're the one who brought it to this program in Ghana. And we did some qualitative research in schools that was, going in and doing a lot of sort of more intensive data collection to try to understand that language match concept, and then really understand what kind of questions do we need to ask in order to assess the language match in each of these schools. And that moved us into a quantitative survey, set of questions that we thought we would be able to get pretty quickly and easily from each school in a very rapid, massive effort of reaching 6,000 schools. So we did not do assessment, actually assessing students. We didn't assess teachers. It was asking them about their languages and their proficiency and getting that feedback, but not actually taking that step of assessment. Exactly. It was basic self-report. So that's something that, of course, definitely would have enriched our data set even more. But we did feel like the qualitative data gave us, from the qualitative, we were able to move into this quantitative set that we felt pretty comfortable with. And then we tested it in one district and refined even further and came up with a set of questions that we thought got us pretty close to what we needed in order to adapt our implementation of the program accordingly. Do you want to comment on that?
Just two things. Thanks. Just two things. I think, you describe it as a simple tool that we were using, but I would say it wasn't. It was simple in the sense that we didn't do assessment of people's actual skills, and it was self-reported, but it wasn't simple in the sense there was a lot of triangulation.
Yeah, that's true.
There were a lot of questions about if you know it, when did you learn it, how did you learn it, how many years have you been speaking it, how many years have you been teaching it, in the sense that will get us, hopefully, a bit closer.
Do you speak this
Right,
exactly. It wasn't a one question, one off sort of.
Exactly.
It was definitely much more comprehensive.
It was more nuanced and comprehensive.
Yeah, and I think that can help us really determine how real, how accurate the teacher's answers were to that question. But it was simple in the sense that, to ask these 5 questions is a lot faster than sitting down at a test.
Right.
So.
And the training was much simpler. We had a mass of enumerators, right? Because we had to do this quickly. So a really intensive EGRA training. I'm not saying that that's what would have been needed, but this was a simple training that they were able to. They were using tablets. Yeah.
So, but the other thing it brings up for me is a question of, do we actually have good information on what the difference is between self-reported information, especially when you're thinking about the difference between speaking, reading, and writing, which can be quite different. It may be that you speak it and you've always spoken it for your whole life, but you may not read and write.
Right.
And
Correct.
so I think the question of how much we can get into with a questionnaire versus a test, and also how close the reported data comes
Aligns.
to what you would find in a test. I think those would be interesting. I mean,
I think there's actually
we know
another
a lot about that.
kind of, you have real testing on one end and just self-report on the other. There's also observational data that would be kind of in the middle in terms of the amount of work involved. We've designed but not implemented a language mapping exercise in DRC, and part of that design is observation, especially for the children. It's not talking to individual kids as much as I think like when the kids are not in class and they're hanging around.
Playground,
So
yeah.
what language is being used among them and so forth. So I think there may be some things that can go a step in the more objective. Yeah, just so I think that's
a great
important. But I think
point.
also the idea of it's not just comprehension, it's not just speaking ability. There's also, can the person write the language? Those are
Yeah.
also valuable facets to know about.
Yep.
But I think we need to think, what's a low-cost way to get the most
lot
accurate
of
data possible?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And what are the ethical implications of the testing aspect is another big one.
Sure.
Yeah, I was intrigued by your comment about census versus, a survey sample, which,
yeah.
boy, if we could get census data in so many places, that would be great. So what it made me ask is, what foundation was built so that people were saying, yeah, it's worth it to actually collect census data, because that is a huge undertaking,
Yeah.
as you mentioned.
It is. It's
And
massive.
you get great
Granularity.
granularity, which is what you want
Yeah.
in this level to look at that stuff. But
So
how did you go about that?
I wasn't the one who went about it, but let me just say that we actually have to implement an 11 language program in 6,000 schools, and we don't know what languages they are currently supposed to be teaching in those 6,000 schools. So we really didn't have a choice. In order to develop a database of schools for our program and what languages they need materials, teaching and learning materials in, we needed to go to the schools and find out. And so it made sense to do this massive mapping before we could roll anything out. I really don't think we had much of a choice.
They could have asked, okay, go to those
Happened.
schools, interview the principals,
Right.
interview a subset of the teachers, and maybe a few students, and see what you can get from that.
Yeah.
Rather than do the real hard work of every school,
Right.
every
Right.
teacher, every
Right.
administrator, every
Right.
student. That's all.
Yeah.
I would love it if we could
And we
have
had
resources to
yeah.
support that kind of census.
Right.
But I think that the census approach doesn't necessarily have to get every teacher. You could do some sampling, but you got to get to every place. And one good thing is you created a framework for gathering that information. So if they decide to go from that many districts to this many districts, there's a repeatable model. We could do this again without some huge investment of research, design, and so forth. You've done the enumerator training, you've developed the instrument.
And it was actually students who did the data collection. So it actually worked out really well. It was the university that did it.
Yeah.
So there are two questions.
Sorry, my thing wasn't on. Do you know more about the pre-service training aspect of this and how the teachers are prepared to teach in Ghanaian language?
I know just a little bit about it, which is that the official languages are available for teachers to study in their programs, in the pre-service programs. But I know that they're not always, they don't always study and go to, the place that they studied for. And so I think there is a degree, the teachers, even the teachers that I've observed, they've actually, the ones that have gone through the local language program have actually been quite good at reading and speaking the language that they studied in the pre-service program. And it does seem to have enabled them to teach well in a place where it's not their native language. So I was quite impressed by that. But I know that they're also not assigned necessarily to places that they've been through a
Right.
pre-service program in. And some people don't benefit from the language also.
But there's
The
not enough to know that actually, if someone had that formal training and went to where that language was used, that it improves the quality of the capability of the teacher. At least.
Anecdotally, it really did. Even some of the teachers who actually who spoke the language in a native, that was their native language.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them were less prepared to teach that local language
Then
than
the
the
second language
teachers
speakers.
who had gone through a formal program,
Yeah.
because they're comfortable. They may not speak at a professional level, but they are okay teaching it, and they also can read it.
So this is a place where some assessment might be valuable to say, okay, we have this anecdotal evidence that it helps to
Right.
formally train. So let's actually assess writing, speaking, comprehension, and so forth for teachers
Yep.
with and without the formal training, and for whom it's their native language or a second language.
Right.
That's a place where I think going deeper would build a case for, we need to do this.
Right.
It needs to be built into the system more systematically.
Right.
So we have some more questions online, but I'm also thinking that we should also...
Oh, we're almost out of time, aren't we?
should
Oh,
start-
it's so fast.
We should start writing stuff down.
Okay. Who's writing?
I can...
But you're also moderating, so you want to write? All right, awesome. So I think, just to summarize, I took a few notes here. I mean, we talked about, before you do a language mapping, you need to know the purpose of it, and there's obviously different purposes for doing it, and so what you actually need probably depends on what policy decisions have to be made. So there's the objective of the survey or the study needs to be related to the, the practical needs, exactly. So that's one thing. And then, let's see. We talked about the complexity of the tools themselves. So whether we are going to actually go to the level of doing student assessment in different languages, doing teacher assessments in different languages, whether we might be able to get similar or equivalent data by asking self-report type questions, and how we can actually understand the accuracy of self-report data, and if that's going to get us what we need, given that, generally speaking, that kind of data collection is cheaper and easier to implement. So I guess going on to the tools, so what kind of tools we use to do language mapping depends on the quality that we expect self-report data to give us, and also what our needs are, what the needs of the
and
data
I think there could be
collection
value in compiling tools that have been
Yeah.
used in order to get a sense of what are they actually like.
are. Right. So you had talked about, exactly. Well, you talked about a couple of different things, but doing some kind of a mapping of all of the mappings that have been done, and that could include aggregating materials and tools and resources, but also potentially we could mine that data for other purposes. You talked about that too. And SIL would have an interest in that, I would imagine, given the ethnologue. We're probably talking too fast. Sorry. So we need more research on that, exactly. Versus self-report data versus observational or testing data, exactly. Or testing. Or testing. Yep. We also talked about census versus sample. Mm-hmm. And how do we convince our donors and our funders to take a census approach? We generally think that is better for a variety of reasons.
So if USAID would require you to do a
Right,
thing as part of a program design, then it's kind of non-controversial. Just go do it.
Right.
We'll try
You
to
do
do
it
it
at the
as
beginning
cheaply as
of a program.
possible and efficiently.
Right.
But I think that would be a reasonable thing to build in any time there's a multilingual reading program going
Yes. Yeah.
It seems to me that if you're doing anything at the national level in terms of benchmarks or policies or language policy or educational policy, that could be a good hook for the for making a case for the language census also. What was just a comment?
on.
And then, and so we also have a recommendation that we do a mapping of the language mappings that have been done and try to understand common tools and approaches and learn from those, and also try to figure out how data can be shared and mined for additional purposes.
It reminds me of the EGRA discussions of a couple of years ago when it's like, can we standardize enough that you can do comparison across settings? And so I think in this mapping thing, there could be also, to the degree that we're kind of gathering comparable data, how can we do it in a way that the information coming from one can be correlated or compared to information coming from someplace else,
Right.
even though you design your thing for local purposes, that if we can also look across
Right.
settings, that could be valuable.
Right. I think that's true. We have some interesting comments coming in, so let me just read some of them. Yeah, I'm on. I hope everyone can hear me. Where did I want to? Oh, here we go. So one note is that USAID in general doesn't support pre-service education, teacher education, so this is a big hole, and just thinking about what that means for our programming and implementation. I think one of the strategies to close the gaps between teachers who can read and write the language of instruction and schools where they teach is to recruit teachers from regional tertiary institutions. So language development and training tends to be stronger at the regional level. So that's a really good point. How have the Ministry of Education responded to the mapping data? And I'm sure it's different in different contexts. In Ghana, as I said, this is fresh off the presses, so we haven't done a formal presentation to them yet. They've seen some of it. We have a political situation in Ghana, as we have everywhere. There's a new government, and so different priorities in the ministry. So we're sort of seeing that play out, and I think the language mapping data is relevant to those debates that are going on.
Abilities of people too, though, so
Yeah.
you don't want to rile somebody up unnecessarily.
Absolutely.
So there needs to be
Yeah.
a bit of sophistication about
Yes.
those kinds of issues.
Those kinds of issues and discussions.
It's not just data.
Absolutely. I feel like there was one that we missed. How do we go through? Oh yeah, here it says, why not adapt the UNESCO framework for evaluating language endangerment?
Yeah,
Paul
there's-
Lewis's adapted framework?
Yeah, so there's language vitality.
Okay.
That's another thing that could be captured. So you have a kind of continuum of how robust is the language, is it going out of use?
Uh-huh.
And there could be some information gathered that would enable you to categorize a language on a continuum. So SIL is using that with the ethnologue now, a scale that goes from kind of an
Okay.
international language down to nobody speaks it anymore
Okay.
kind of thing. And to knowing where a language falls on that would be instructive in knowing what's the trajectory for this language. So is it that the grandparents speak it, but their children don't, and the grandchildren don't?
Right.
Or where is it in a continuum?
Yes,
Is
wow.
it being intergenerational transmission is an important issue for knowing the trajectory of a language, that kind of thing.
So how would that relate to the language mapping? Are there
Well,
questions
if-
we could ask or somehow?
To the degree that it's an official language, it's less likely that it's a language that's going out of use. But there is a kind of reality check. How vigorously is this language being used? Are the children actually learning it and coming
Right.
to school with it? So, but if, like you all are dealing with languages that aren't official languages of instruction, it's important to know, so what is the status of that language?
Right.
How vigorously is it being used? What are we finding out about kind of the non-target languages that would enrich our understanding of the linguistic situation in Ghana, for example?
Does that carry us into the conversation about new languages of instruction being added?
Yeah, so if you've got a language that's in vigorous use, all generations are using it, it is in writing and so forth, you're looking, okay, that's probably a language that's a candidate
Right.
for because the next level up on the scale is used in education. So
Right.
there might be languages that
Right.
are just right up at that boundary and are good candidates for doing a few critical things to put them into a official language of instruction mode.
Interesting. Okay. Other comments? Let's see. Okay, one challenge in certain places is that teachers from really rural areas don't really want to stay there and teach. They want to be
Yeah.
able to move into a more urban or developed part of the country, but usually that's in a different language area. We also have gender dimensions to that as well, with women not necessarily being able or willing to go work in rural areas. So what do we do about teacher match in that kind of a scenario where people don't want to work in the areas where their languages are the dominant language?
Well, I think
How
one of
can
the
you
things that got
incentivize?
mentioned was about local language teaching assistants. So non-formally trained teachers. So that one way, if the person who bothers to get their formal training wants to go someplace else, there might be local people who are intelligent and really know the
everyone.
language
I
and could
noticed
serve
that
alongside
most groups
a
have
teacher who
hung up
might be a
flip
poor
chart
match.
papers or
but
are
paired
getting
together
ready
with somebody
to.
local, then you
If
might
you
be able
could
to address.
Finish up your flip
Ameliorate
chart
the
papers
language
and get them up
mismatch.
on the wall for in the
Have we
next
seen any
3
of that in
minutes.
Ghana?
We
What
could
are
do
people
the
doing?
gallery walk starting promptly at noon.
Promptly at noon, so we have 7 minutes.
Some places do this more than others. See, I haven't seen the kind of the local language teaching assistant thing.
I haven't seen that very much in Ghana.
I know it's been used in Thailand. Peru actually wrote a law recognizing it's a formal role, but there's no budget behind it. But you can have a formal position of teaching assistant specifically for language. So I think it's very locally determined as whether that's legitimate or not. But in Thailand, you have to have a formal credential. You're almost certainly a male. And you're probably not from the local area. And so I think that some programs there that have used this local language assistant
Right.
in effective ways. Who was it? I think it was Rachel. Was it
Christina?
Yeah, I think it was her that mentioned that.
I think that would actually fill a big need in Ghana because what I did notice is that they use, and I've heard from many like urban and rural contexts, they use other pupils
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
classroom to do the translation, but that often leads to mistranslation. So I think that community volunteer idea is might be a much better.
But I
We're
think
getting into solutions now.
That could get into a practical solution for this. So the mapping brings a mismatch to the surface.
Right.
And immediately people want to know, so what do we do?
What do we do about it?
So
Yeah.
this issue, I think, is one that's worth researching. Has that been used effectively? What made it effective? And what does that tell us about other places where we're struggling with the mismatch?
Right.
Well,
issue?
and
Oh, got it.
Stage, so there's one more comment, and then we'll have to turn the mics to.
if I could just wrap up that conversation, just saying that if we're language mapping, I think we should also be asking about people's local language solutions, because I saw in Ghana a range of interesting solutions that we may not have thought of ourselves. So let's not constrain what the questions might bring up.
Great. You want to? Oh.
Yeah, someone just wanted to add, Ghana does have detached teachers in some schools who can step in to teach a lesson if the classroom teacher can't speak.
Right. So that's one of those solutions
A lot of
that's
them.
in place already. Yeah, exactly. Okay, great. I think we have to wrap up this group discussion, given that we have to give up our mics. But thank you, everyone, for joining online and in person. And we will, I guess, for the gallery walk, the online folks might be out of luck.
No, but I'm sure the outputs will be
Will be
distributed,
shared.
yeah.
Exactly. So thanks. Okay, so are they expected to rejoin us at some point? Around 12:10, we will come back together for the final closing remarks. Thanks, everyone.